Hey everybody, this is Dr. Chris Doss. Thanks so much for joining me today on my page, Biblical Languages and Literature. Before we get started, I want to let you know about some of the exciting course offerings in biblical languages and literature that are being offered through Sabra Global Education, like Dr. Steve Notley's course, Jesus' Parables as Jewish Scripture. This is a great course for those who have a desire to better understand the Jewishness of the New Testament. The book of Isaiah from yesterday to today, which is an ongoing weekly course with Rabbi Dr. Robert Harris of the Jewish Theological Seminary, as well as my own course, How to Read the Bible, Tools for Studying the Jewish and Christian Scriptures. This is an 8-session class that meets 1 hour per week, in which I teach tools and methods for studying the Jewish and Christian Scriptures, including history, culture, and yes, even a bit of language. We look at just the basic elements of Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic. And don't worry if you're intimidated by languages, we just deal with the elements so that the student can start to use more sophisticated print and electronic resources for studying the Bible. This course meets live from 8 to 9 p.m. Eastern Time, May 10th through June 28th, but it's okay if you can't make the live sessions, as each class is always recorded and uploaded to an online classroom. So be sure to register today. And if these courses might interest a group at your local church, synagogue, or learning group, Sabra offers significant group discounts. Contact info@sabraedu.com to find out more. All right, let's get to our video.
And we have 13 letters in our New Testament that we would call Paul's writings. Of the letters that make it into the New Testament, we have 13. And of the ones that we can tell which city he's writing to, we know that they are major cities. Major cities are usually cities that have ports, that over time, like Ephesus, that over time have developed a strong import-export and have a lot of roads going to them and going out of them. A lot of the cities are like this. So, for instance, Corinth has a port, Ephesus has a port. And then you have other cities that are next to ports. Thessalonica, right, is going to be a major city of the first century. Then you're also going to have him writing to major areas. Like Galatia is not a city. Galatia is the section of Turkey, Central Asia Minor in the first century, that is representative of the cities that he first came in contact with: Lystra, Derbe, Iconium, these cities that are important. And the reason they're important is that if you go to a major hub, like let's say Ephesus, he spends a lot of time in Ephesus. If you go to a major hub, you are going to have smaller roads that make their way into more urban areas, okay? So if the good news for Paul going to Gentiles is going to be in major cities, then you have people from coming out of those cities, doing their shopping, their business, their worship. If they're part of the Greco-Roman religious system, they're coming in. And what happens is that these individuals are going to hear the good news from Paul. They become followers of Jesus. And as followers of Jesus, they're going to carry that message to their smaller towns abroad. So all of Paul's movements are strategic, but he's always moving among a majority of non-Jewish communities, okay? Now, in each of these places, you're going to have strong Jewish communities, right? And his first stop is always going to be at the synagogue. He's never going to go to the Gentiles first. He stops at the synagogue as his first sort of his methodology. And once he is there, what he's going to come in contact with are not only Jewish people. He's also going to come in contact with individuals like a Cornelius. If you ever read Acts 10, he's going to come in contact with Greek, Roman, non-Jewish individuals who come to the belief in the God of Israel. And they're sometimes referred to as God worshipers or God-fearers. And they will go to the synagogue to hear the teaching from the commandments, from the Torah, from the Bible. And when Paul goes, they're also going to hear the good news. Okay. And this is what's going to sort of begin the work with the non-Jewish Gentile communities. But when Paul goes to these cities, he's always dealing in a context that is familiar to him only because he grew up in Tarsus, but not familiar to him from when he studied in Jerusalem, or I should say not as familiar. When we talk about Jesus and John the Baptist, their context within a Jewish world is a much more comfortable context because there are cities we know archaeologically, like the cities of Jesus, like the area of the Galilee, that maintained a very strong Jewish identity in their particular cities. Okay. Now there are major cities that had Greco-Roman influence. And there was naturally Greco-Roman influence even within the development of Judaism. But we don't have in Israel, the land of Israel, a lot of Greco-Roman temples. We do have some, but we don't have a lot in the way that you see when you go outside. And that's going to be important because Paul's going to have to negotiate that world. And there's a question about, you may ask now, well, what does this have to do with the Dead Sea Scrolls? There's a question about, in terms of who Paul is, our assumption being that when God calls him to go on his missionary journeys, as it's described in the book of Acts, that God is using something about Paul, something about Saul, something about who he was and who he becomes, to be the right person to go to the Gentiles. And how does he shape that discussion for the people that he is speaking to? And that's not always easy to figure out, because the person that we have most of outside of the four Gospels of Jesus, the person that we know most about, both about what's said about him and what he tells us via his letters, is the Apostle Paul. We know less about Peter. We know way less about John the Baptist, and the other apostles we know even less. To the right here, you will see, just for interest's sake, when you're reading Paul's letters, you will see here he has some lost letters. In the first epistle to Corinth, he references first epistle to Corinth in 1 Corinthians, which means he's speaking about one previously. In 2 Corinthians, he's speaking about another letter. And then in Ephesians, he references another letter that he has written to Ephesus. And so on. You see the letter to Laodiceans referenced in Colossians. We don't have any of these letters. These are just things that are referenced by Paul in his letters. The point is probably just to let us know that Paul, or gives the indication that Paul is writing more letters than we see. We don't know. No one's ever laid eyes on any of these letters. They've never been found in a monastery. There are no manuscripts. This is not a question of canonicity because there's nothing to measure canonically. Most scholars are going to agree that the majority of Paul's audience in all of his letters is going to be Gentiles, non-Jews. Now, this is not going to be true of every single letter, but every single letter is going to have Gentiles as part of their audience, and often they're going to be the majority audience. There is going to be a minority audience where he is dealing specifically with Jewish people. And you may say, well, I read Paul's letters. I don't know where those differences happen. And the reason you don't know where those differences happen is because Paul's speaking to a community that he knows. So there's no need for him to split up and say verses 3 to 4, Jewish folk, verses 5 to 6, Gentiles, verses 12 to 13, Jews and Gentiles. Whoever's reading the letter, because remember, only 2% to 5% of people could read in the first century. Whoever's reading the letter to the community understands when Paul is speaking to them because he's using catchwords that address them. With regard to Paul and the Dead Sea Scrolls, the reason he is so interesting with regard to the Dead Sea Scrolls are the ideas and the language that he uses in his letters that make connection with the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, we're not going to go over all of these, but I'm giving you a survey of some of the things that we have, okay? Some of the things that we have are going to include a dualistic worldview, which means that the way Paul speaks, probably because he's speaking to Gentiles and then their Jewish compatriots, is that he often carves out the world in two. How do we see that? Or how do we note that? The first reason we're going to note that is that we have dualistic language, which means in the ancient world, when someone viewed the cosmos dualistically, they often viewed the world is being split in two and that those two forces were vying against each other. Okay, that's usually what we mean by dualism. Then there are different degrees of dualism, but there's no point in getting into that now. On a couple of occasions, Paul, especially in the book of Romans, and even in other letters, compares light to darkness, flesh and spirit. In 1 Corinthians, he speaks of Christ and Belial. In Romans, he speaks about strong and weak. That division that we first start getting out of wisdom literature is also very prevalent, not only in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but very prevalent among the community scrolls. In other words, the scrolls that were written and copied by the community themselves. In other words, remember, we talked about them seeing themselves as the sons of light and everyone else as a son of darkness. That is a dualism. Those two parties, which this was an idea of that Jesus wasn't very happy with, the whole idea that you shall hate the sons of darkness. Paul is using that structure that we have in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Maybe I would say not in the same way that the Dead Sea Scrolls folk were using it, but he's doing it in a way that helps to set the stage for who he's talking to.
To learn more about this course or any of Sabra Global Education's Bible and theology courses, click the link in the description below or contact us at info@sabraedu.com, info@sabraedu.com. And don't forget to ask about our special group rates.